So I got back yesterday and this letter was sitting on the doorstep. It's a letter from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and it is informing me how much tax I paid last year, how they worked it out, and what they spent it on. And I was also thinking about him. I think that it is a very good thing that in this country the government will give money to help what we might want to call, what some people call the deserving poor. People who can't feed and clothe themselves, people who can't find shelter for themselves. But that leaves us with a question. You see, one of the things that people I teach know interests me is how we make decisions. Everything from big decisions is torture right, big moral decisions, to what are you going to have for lunch. People make decisions in very strange ways, and we like to think we're rational about it. So Dr. McMahon talked a few weeks ago now about thinking fast, thinking slow, the way perhaps our minds sometimes make wrong decisions, and I think we like to think we make very sensible, step-by-step reasoned choices. But actually, quite a lot of the time we don't. So, for example, it tells me here what tax I paid. So apparently last year I contributed just under £2,000 to the welfare bill, about £1,400 to health, about £1,000 to education. All sounds fairly reasonable. State pensions, £1,000 to state pensions. Not sure I'm going to get one by the time I get there. Not sure it's very well run. Not sure that's the kind of thing I think my tax money should be being spent on. We can't just magic up money to hand to this chap. I hope most people here think it's reasonable that we might want to give him a bit. But that can't come from nowhere. It's got to come from us. How do we decide whether it's right to take money that you guys have earned, money that I've earned, and give it to someone who isn't earning it? Gets even more important question. We think, so I paid somewhere around £8,000 tax last year. My father, it turns out, paid more than I earn. Your parents, if you're here not on bursaries and things, if you're here paid out of income, probably pay considerably more than I earn in tax. What gives us the right, or how do we decide whether we have the right to take money that you've earned and give it to someone else? And that set me thinking about these guys. Jeremy Bentham on this side, he was a political philosopher, a social reformer, he was involved in setting up UCL. He was so certain there was no life after death that he had himself stuffed and put in that glass case. If you go to UCL, you can see him. Apparently, he still gets wheeled out to preside over board meetings. I don't know if it's true. The other chap is his nephew, John Stuart Mill. He was somewhat of a child prodigy, but his uncle and his father had some very strange ideas about education. They basically experimented on him. So he learned ancient Greek first by the age of 4. He learned English via Greek. Apparently by the age of 10 he was fluent in Latin. He was put in charge of his siblings' education, and if his siblings didn't do well enough, his dad wouldn't feed him. By the age of 20 he'd had a nervous breakdown. But between the two of them, perhaps not the kind of people we want to take advice on decision making from, but they came up with and talked about probably the most influential suggestion as to how we make decisions. You guys probably do it the whole time without thinking about it. They talked about utilitarianism. Let's try a little experiment. Hands up who thinks murder is morally acceptable. Hands up for yes. One at the back, Mr. Yorston. Hands up for no. Most people, normally unacceptable. But let's change the context a bit. You are off on your gap year, in the jungle, looking after small furry monkeys. And suddenly, you are taken hostage by a bunch of gorillas. They take you and your 4 friends hostage, and they hand you a gun, and they say, pick which one you're going to shoot, or we shoot the lot of you. Well, the context changes things a bit, doesn't it? Bentham said, an action may be conformable to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than that which it has to diminish it. Or in English, greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's what utilitarianism is about. We make decisions by deciding what's going to make the greatest number of people more happy or limit their harm. He completely rejected anything to do with morality. There is no morality as far as he's concerned. Right and wrong doesn't come into it. Social pressures don't come into it. Religion doesn't come into it. It's all about greatest good for greatest number of people. So, is it okay to take money off you guys, your parents, off me, and give it to this chap? Well, I take it that while we'd very much like a holiday house somewhere nice and sunny and warm, he'd get much more benefit from having his first house. So yes, greater happiness for the greatest number says take that money off those of us who are wealthy and give it to him. Frankly, whether he's deserving or not, it will still increase society's happiness. What about murder? Well, it depends on the context, doesn't it? One death, you picking that person and shooting them, creates much less unhappiness than all 5 of you being shot. So yes, in that context, that murder is absolutely fine. But what about war? Probably one of the most justified wars, or at least in hindsight people see as justified in recent years, is the Second World War. A short clip which some of you may or may not recognise. Some of you may recognise that as the scene from Band of Brothers, where they first find the concentration camps. Now, it's debatable what, if anything, we knew about the concentration camps before we went to war, but lots of people at least say, in hindsight, that justifies all that death and all that suffering. After all, 6 million Jews and others died in the concentration camps in Germany. But 8 million Germans alone, excluding those, died as a result of the Second World War. 6 million, 8 million. Utilitarianism says that actually, huge, horrific suffering, but maybe we caused more suffering going to war than we would have solved. Maybe, hard as it is, we should have said, we can't fix that, we should leave it alone. But I suppose if the war had gone on, the numbers would have kept rising, wouldn't have stopped at 6 million. Estimates vary, but 80 million is one of the estimates for how many people died worldwide as a result of the Second World War. So, probably what most people here would view as one of the more justified wars that we've seen maybe caused horrific amounts more suffering than it solved. Utilitarianism, at least, would say that wasn't the right thing to do. We should have left that alone. That's Apu. He runs a corner shop. He enjoys it. He's good at it. But he has a problem. Hans has moved in next door. Hans isn't very keen on him. And worse than that, Hans has quite a few friends. They're quite keen on going round, causing some trouble, beating up Apu, and burning down the shop. That's their idea of a great evening out. Well, clearly Apu isn't very keen on this. Apu's family's not very keen on this. But there's an awful lot of Hans's friends. Utilitarianism, in its purest form, says if they get enough benefit, enough enjoyment from going around, beating him up, burning down the shop, that it outweighs all the unhappiness for Apu and his family, that's okay. In fact, that's more than okay. If they get enough happiness from it, we should encourage it. It's a good thing. It improves the happiness of society. See, it turns out utilitarianism has a few issues if we're going to use it to make decisions. And so it's probably the way you guys automatically make decisions every day. It's certainly the way most of us make decisions every day. But if utilitarianism has issues, perhaps we've got to decide how we are going to make decisions. So if, like me, you believe in a God, that's not too tricky. The Creed says, if you're a Christian, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. If you believe that, it stands to reason that the God that made everything has both the right and the knowledge to know to tell us how to live. So it might be difficult to do, but it shouldn't be too difficult to work out what's right and wrong. But my guess is quite a lot of us here aren't theists and don't believe in a God. So how can we make decisions? Well, utilitarianism, at least on its own, doesn't work. It might be all right for the day-to-day decisions. It's no good for the big decisions. We've seen all the problems with that. What about social norms? Well, that sounds okay, but for hundreds of years slavery was normal. Slavery was considered fine, a perfectly reasonable thing to do. For years and years and years it was okay to see black people as less worthy than white people and could just be owned and kept as property. For years it was seen that children had no rights. So maybe social norms don't work for us either. What about conscience? Conscience is sort of all right, but Hans was very happy with what he was doing. He didn't see a problem. He quite enjoyed it. So conscience doesn't work for us either. I'm not sure I have an answer, but I do have a question, which is, if none of those work, how do we make decisions? Because there are going to be some big decisions coming along, and maybe from academic interest, maybe just from making the right decisions, it's probably a good idea for us to have a think about how we want to make ours.